We are at DEFCON 3. Let that land for a second. Not DEFCON 5, which is Tuesday morning in peacetime. Not DEFCON 4, which is elevated but manageable. DEFCON 3. The United States military has just raised its defense readiness condition to a level not seen across all unified combatant commands since 1973, since the Yom Kippur War, when the world held its breath and most people alive today weren't even born yet. Nuclear forces are on increased alert right now. Strategic bombers are dispersing to forward operating locations right now. The command posts that would direct nuclear operations in a decapitation scenario have been activated right now. And most Americans woke up this morning, poured their coffee, checked their phones, and had absolutely no idea any of this was happening. That is a failure, not just of media, not just of government. It is a failure of the entire system that is supposed to keep informed citizens capable of understanding the world their children are going to inherit. So we are going to fix that today. We are going to talk about what DEFCON 3 actually means, what Vladimir Putin just activated in Russia's nuclear doctrine, and why the next few weeks may be the most consequential stretch of time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we are going to do it without the diplomatic softening and the careful hedging that passes for analysis in most places. You deserve the unfiltered version. If you are new here and you want coverage that goes beyond the headlines and actually explains what is happening to this country and this world, subscribe right now. Hit the bell, because this story is not going away and you are going to want to be here when the next development breaks. Let's start with what Vladimir Putin actually did, because the headlines have been breathtakingly inadequate at explaining it. Putin did not rattle a saber. Putin did not issue a vague threat on state television. Putin formally activated a revised set of nuclear doctrine provisions that have been in development for 18 months. Provisions that the Western strategic community has been quietly terrified of since draft language started circulating earlier this year. This was a legal, operational, doctrinal change to the framework that governs when and how Russia is authorized to use its nuclear arsenal. That is not the same thing as a speech. That is not the same thing as a press conference. That is a change to the rulebook that Russian military commanders operate under, and it has immediate and concrete implications for every military calculation NATO makes from this day forward. Here is what you need to understand about how Russian nuclear doctrine worked before this revision. There were two basic conditions under which Russia claimed the right to use nuclear weapons. First, in response to a nuclear attack against Russia or its allies. Second, in response to a conventional military attack so severe that it threatened the very existence of the Russian state. Those two pillars still exist. They are still in the revised doctrine. But what Putin's team has done is surgically and deliberately redefine the operational meaning of those pillars in ways that lower the threshold for nuclear use so significantly that they have fundamentally altered the strategic calculus that has kept nuclear weapons out of active consideration since 1945. This is not a subtle procedural update. This is a structural change to the most dangerous framework on Earth, and it happened with almost no serious public discussion in this country about what it actually means. The first major revision, and pay close attention here because this one is particularly alarming, states that a conventional weapons attack against Russia's nuclear command and control infrastructure will now be treated as equivalent to a nuclear attack and will authorize a nuclear response. Read that again. A conventional strike. Missiles with regular warheads. A cyber operation that degrades the functionality of Russia's early warning systems. These actions, which NATO planners had previously considered to fall well below the nuclear threshold, now formally justify a strategic nuclear response under Russian military law. Think about what that means in practice. Ukraine has been using Western-supplied precision weapons to strike inside Russian territory. Some of those strikes have hit infrastructure that, under this new doctrine, could be characterized as touching Russia's nuclear command architecture. The line between a conventional military operation and a nuclear trigger has just been moved, dramatically closer to where the actual fighting is happening. The second revision concerns what happens when Russia faces a large-scale conventional assault using precision weapons, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles with conventional warheads, drone swarms targeting critical infrastructure or producing significant territorial losses. The new doctrine explicitly states that this category of attack can meet the threshold for nuclear employment. Russia is formally asserting the right to go nuclear not just when its existence is threatened in some abstract civilizational sense, but in response to large-scale conventional military operations that it assesses as strategically destabilizing. The flexibility that NATO military planners previously had to conduct significant conventional operations without crossing nuclear thresholds has been dramatically compressed. Every planning document, every wargame, every operational scenario that assumed conventional conflict could be kept conventional now needs to be reconsidered from scratch. The third revision is the one that reportedly has the Pentagon most concerned, and when you hear it, you will understand why. The revised doctrine explicitly extends Russia's nuclear umbrella to cover Belarus and any other state with which Russia has formal defense agreements. It then adds language, deliberately vague language, about whether conventional attacks on Russian forces operating in support of those allies could trigger nuclear escalation. This intentional ambiguity is a strategic weapon in its own right. When NATO planners do not know precisely where the red line is located, they have to assume it could be anywhere. That uncertainty imposes a cost on every decision. It creates hesitation, it creates caution, and from Moscow's perspective, that hesitation and caution is exactly the point. Now let's talk about the American response, because understanding DEFCON 3 requires understanding what it actually is and what it actually does not in the abstract, but in concrete operational terms that explain why this elevation is significant. DEFCON is a 5-tier system. 5 is normal peacetime operations. 1 is nuclear war, either underway or imminent. 3 is the midpoint, and reaching it across all unified combatant commands is an event that has not happened in over 50 years. This is not a drill. This is not a precautionary measure that the Pentagon takes lightly. The decision to elevate to DEFCON 3 triggers a cascade of observable, measurable changes to how American military forces are postured, and those changes have already begun. The strategic bomber force, the B-52S, the B-2S, the B-1S, has begun dispersal operations. These aircraft are moving from their primary bases to forward operating locations and austere airfields spread across a wider geographic area. The reason is survivability. If you concentrate your bomber fleet on a small number of bases and an adversary launches a first strike, you risk losing that entire component of your nuclear triad in the opening minutes of a conflict. Dispersal protects the force and ensures that even under the worst-case scenario, America retains the capacity to respond. Open-source flight tracking already confirmed B-52 movements from Barksdale Air Force Base within hours of the DEFCON elevation. This is not a rumor. This is observable, documented, and real. The ballistic missile submarine force, which already operates on continuous patrol cycles, has increased its at-sea presence and repositioned boats to what military planners call launch baskets, geographic positions that optimize coverage of priority target sets. The ICBM force, which is always on alert regardless of DEFCON level, has increased the manning of its launch control centers and is conducting readiness drills at higher frequency. The E-4B Night Watch aircraft, the airborne command posts that would direct nuclear operations if ground-based infrastructure were destroyed, are flying more frequently and conducting more extensive communications checks with the National Command Authority. Every element of the nuclear command and control system is being postured for rapid execution, and here is what that means at the human level, because this is where most of the analysis completely fails to go. Somewhere in this country right now, there are men and women sitting in underground facilities and aircraft cockpits and submarine control rooms who are doing their jobs with the knowledge that the decisions they make under time pressure and with incomplete information could determine whether civilization survives the next few weeks. These are not abstractions. These are human beings operating in a system designed for exactly this scenario, and the system functions as intended, but it functions through human judgment, and human judgment, under sustained stress, over extended periods, with compressed decision timelines, degrades. Every day that DEFCON 3 is maintained without resolution is a day that increases the cumulative fatigue of the people inside the machine. That is not a criticism of those people. It is a fact about human physiology under stress, and it is a fact that the analysts talking about this situation in comfortable studios are not spending nearly enough time discussing. This is the middle of the story, and the middle is where things get complicated. I want to stop here and ask you something directly. If you are watching this and you are getting information that you cannot get anywhere else, information that actually explains the mechanisms, not just the headlines, share this right now. Send it to someone who needs to understand what is happening. Subscribe if you have not already, because the next 72 hours could bring developments that require immediate, serious analysis, and you are going to want to be here for it. Here is the part that nobody in the mainstream wants to explain clearly, because explaining it clearly forces you to confront something deeply uncomfortable about the world we are living in. Both of the major moves in this crisis, Putin's Doctrine revision and America's DEFCON elevation, are individually defensible as rational, defensive responses to a genuinely threatening security environment. That is the terrifying part. Neither side is acting crazy. Neither side is being reckless for its own sake. Both sides are making calculated, internally coherent decisions based on threat assessments that their respective strategic communities believe are accurate, and together, those two rational, defensible, individually coherent decisions are creating a situation that is less stable, more dangerous, and closer to catastrophic miscalculation than anything we have seen in 60 years. This is what a nuclear escalation spiral looks like. It does not require one side to be irrational. It does not require a villain. It requires two adversaries, each making reasonable decisions in response to what the other is doing, each of whose reasonable decisions becomes evidence that justifies the other's next reasonable decision, until the feedback loop has produced a security environment that neither side wanted, chose, or can easily escape. From Moscow's perspective, the logic runs like this. NATO has been expanding eastward for decades despite Russian objections. Western nations have been providing Ukraine with precision weapons of increasing range and capability, some of which have been used to strike inside Russian territory. The United States and its allies have been conducting military exercises near Russian borders at a scale and frequency that Moscow interprets as preparation for a larger confrontation. In that context, revising the nuclear doctrine to lower the threshold for nuclear employment is a deterrent signal, a way of imposing costs and risks on Western decision-making that will, in theory, cause NATO planners to think twice before taking actions that Russia views as unacceptably escalatory. That logic is internally coherent from a Russian strategic perspective. You do not have to agree with it, you do not have to accept the premises, but you have to understand it, because you cannot manage a crisis you do not understand. From Washington's perspective, the logic runs like this. Russia has just formally lowered the threshold for nuclear weapons use in ways that introduce genuine ambiguity about whether large-scale conventional operations in support of Ukraine could trigger a nuclear response. Given that ambiguity, given the impossibility of being certain what Russian military commanders are prepared to do, the responsible course of action is to ensure that American nuclear forces are postured to respond rapidly if the situation deteriorates. Moving to DEFCON 3 reduces the risk of being caught flat-footed if Russia's doctrine revision turns out to be a precursor to actual nuclear employment rather than a deterrent signal. That logic is also internally coherent from an American strategic perspective, and the deep structural problem that should be keeping everyone in this chain of command awake at night is that Russia interprets the DEFCON elevation as confirmation that NATO is preparing for a larger confrontation, which validates the threat perception that motivated the doctrine revision in the first place, and the United States interprets the doctrine revision as confirmation that Russia is willing to use nuclear weapons at a lower threshold than previously understood, which validates the threat assessment that motivated the DEFCON elevation. Each side's defensive action becomes evidence supporting the other side's worst fears. That is the spiral, and once it is in motion, it is extraordinarily difficult to stop. Let's talk about what stopping it would actually require, because this is where almost all of the public commentary goes completely soft. There is a lot of vague language about diplomacy and dialogue and off-ramps, and almost none of it grapples with the concrete, specific, politically excruciating things that would have to happen for both sides to step back from where they are standing right now. For Russia, de-escalation is not as simple as Putin deciding to reverse course and issue a statement. The doctrine revision was framed publicly as a necessary defensive response to Western aggression. Walking it back without something concrete to show for it would be a political catastrophe domestically. Moscow needs to be able to tell its internal audience that the doctrine revision achieved its deterrent objective, that it successfully imposed costs on Western planning and produced commitments that reduce the threat to Russian strategic interests. That means Russia needs some form of assurance, whether public or private, that NATO will not continue expanding the range and capability of weapons provided to Ukraine, will not push further toward formal Ukrainian NATO membership, and will not use the current crisis as cover for advancing military positions that Moscow views as unacceptable. Those are not small asks, and depending on where you sit politically, some of them may strike you as outrageous. But the question is not whether Russia's demands are reasonable. The question is whether there is a path back from the edge, and that path runs through understanding what it would actually take for each side to move. For the United States, de-escalation requires something equally difficult: political courage in an environment that rewards firmness and punishes anything that can be characterized as backing down in the face of nuclear threats. The domestic political environment in America in 2026 is not one that easily accommodates the kind of nuanced, face-saving, mutually face-saving diplomatic maneuvering that nuclear crisis management requires, any move that can be framed as weakness, any gesture toward accommodation, any reduction in the DEFCON posture before Russia has made observable changes to its own force posture carries enormous political risk for whoever authorizes it. The most realistic path to de-escalation, based on everything we know about how these crises have been managed historically, runs through direct presidential-level communication, not back-channel diplomatic signaling, not carefully worded statements from defense ministries, actual direct communication between the leaders of the two countries with the capacity to destroy civilization, in which both parties acknowledge that the current trajectory benefits neither side and that there are specific, concrete, observable steps each could take to reduce the immediate risk of catastrophic miscalculation. That kind of communication requires a degree of trust, a degree of mutual recognition of legitimate interests, and a degree of political will that, frankly, is in very short supply in both Washington and Moscow right now. That is not pessimism. That is an honest assessment of the conditions that currently exist. I am going to keep covering this story every single day for as long as it takes, because this is the most important thing happening in the world right now, and the people who should be explaining it clearly are not doing their jobs. If this gave you something real, something you could not get from the headlines, something that actually explains the mechanisms and the stakes, then do three things right now. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening, and leave your honest assessment in the comments. Do you believe the current leadership structures in Moscow and Washington are capable of managing this crisis back from the edge? I want to know what you think, because your judgment matters, and because what happens next will be shaped by whether enough people understand the reality clearly enough to demand that the people in power handle it with the seriousness it deserves. Stay with me. This is far from over.